All right, welcome to the Imperial 80s. Good to be with you again. I'm Tume.
Good to be with you too, Jared, and peace everybody out there watching.
Yeah, thank you for tuning in. I just want to, we'll say this probably many times, but I want to apologize in advance to everyone that
Yeah.
felt a need to like watch this movie to prepare for today because
Uh,
wow, as PJ here said, it was an absolutely brutal rewatch and I think we all had that experience. So we'll talk about that. Make sure to like, share, subscribe wherever you're at. We're streaming today on YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. So it's good to be with you all. Um, and yeah, I mean, we should bring our guest up. Is there anything else you
yeah.
wanted to say before?
No, I think we should bring our guests right in and
Yeah.
get to it.
Right on. Support the Patreon too, the Imperial 80s Patreon. We will probably do another, we'll see if we have time. We may do another short bonus episode that we'll get up there in the next couple days. So we'll see if that works out. But Alex, good to be with you, my friend.
Hey guys, how's it going? Thanks for having me. Listen, can I say something first?
Go
Okay,
ahead.
so all your previous guests got to like break down very cool, like iconic movies of the 1980s: Predator, RoboCop, Red Dawn. But then Jay asked me to do Three Amigos. and I will say that it's also probably like a little racist because I'm Mexican that he asked me to do Three Amigos. I'm just kidding, Jay. This is how bothered I am having to rewatch this like absolutely terrible movie.
To be fair, I mean, it's absolutely a little racist, but to be fair, the audience chose this, right? So like I mean, to be clear, it was one that I suggested as a possibility. So that's on me. But
I will not speak ill of the masses, Jay, only you.
The audience, the Patreon members, there were other options. We could have done G.I. Joe with you, which I still think we need to do with you at some point to also redeem and give you something way equally
not
problematic.
Redeem me, redeem the show. Poor show, man. I don't know if you guys are gonna survive the Three Amigos.
I don't know either. This might be the death nail.
See, is Orasami Burton voted for this, right? Like,
oh man. Oh no.
I'm absolved. All right. So where do we want to start?
I mean, I think we should start with a general kind of framing of the movie, tell people what it is. I mean, I do think there is some things that are interesting in it, like historically, just in terms of where comedy, I mean, this is 86. So you're really at a point where like Hollywood is putting a lot of money into these comedies and these movies, and you just don't have your action stars. You have your comedy stars, like, and I mean really two of the biggest comedy stars in one movie, Chevy Chase and Steve Martin, and then someone like John Landis, who is connected to so many of these 80s films, from Trading Places. Was it Blues Brothers he also did, right? Was it Blues Brothers? This one,
Animal House.
Animal House. That's the other one. Animal House. He's connected to so many, and also the infamous Twilight Zone, the movie thing with him and his existence that I think many people have actually forgotten about. I don't think many people actually know that about him. I think you tell people about it and they go, "Oh wow, interesting. I never knew about that." But it was in its time, it was huge.
You should say something about that because he's actually on trial for this as he's directing
Yeah. Maybe not this second, but yeah, we'll definitely bring that up. And it actually affects, I think, the final edit of the film, because there's actual, I think there's two big, there's one person, Sam Kinison, there's one scene that was shot, I know, with a famous actor that's not in the movie, because the studio cut it out. And Landis claims he doesn't know why. He says he never got a clear answer. But yeah, Landis, so it's, mid 80s, these things are like really big. And I think there's there's a kind of attitude towards them that are like, oh, they're just these kinds of, you know, funny things that were kind of happening, or even some people, I mean, because we also have to like to say it, like this movie has a huge cult. There are people who love the Three Amigos. I mean, it was a box office failure. It wasn't a successful film. It wasn't well reviewed either. Probably, I would say middle of the road reviewed. It wasn't totally panned, but it was definitely middle of the road reviewed. But, you know, but with that being said, you look at the kind of ideas that are in the movie, and you begin to also uncover that the comedies were also doing a certain kind of, you know, contribution to the Imperial Project here in the US. That was, you know, alongside all the other stuff like the lethal weapons. And this, and I'm gonna say, I mean, this is like one of my big theses that I thought about it, is I realized, and I was watching some interviews with Steve Martin, and listening to him, and I realized is the comedy guys also have some of the same ambitions of the action or drama guys. They want that same kind of adoration that the other ones have, right? They want to be able to have the virility, they want to get the girl, you know, they want to be able to be heroic. But of course, you know, we're never going to believe Steve Martin playing Martin Riggs, right? But we're going to believe Steve Martin as the guy he is in this movie, right? You know, and it fills the same kind of function, I think, for a certain type of personality, right? That doesn't see themselves traditionally as hero, and the untraditional heroes. And then, you know, who gets to be the villains, you know, the primitives in Mexico. So yeah, we can start there. But I think maybe we start with also, Jay, how we were with the movie. Like when did we first watch it, you know, and seeing it again, what was our responses to that?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I mean, so I saw this as, I think, some semblance of a fifth birthday present, right? So I turned 5 in December of 1986, and you know, I've talked about this already, but my parents were, you know, I was fairly sheltered from seeing like big action movies or things like that I wanted to see as a, you know, young kid, but I really wanted to go see movies in the theater, right? And the 80s also is a very bad time. We'll talk about this, I'm sure, as we go through more children's movies and stuff like that. But for children's movies, like, you know, Samantha Youssef has talked about this, like Disney is kind of in a lull. Like there's just not a whole lot for kids to see. And at the same time, a lot of the action stuff is actually marketed to kids pretty heavily in this era, right? And so, you know, I'm sure this was like a compromise from my parents of thinking, oh, you know, like Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, like, I mean, I know that they would have known that a lot of their stuff is, and this movie too, like I realized there was a lot of sexual jokes that I didn't understand as a 5-year old in the film. But yeah, so you know, I saw it. I liked it, but you know, at the same time, like I take my kids to see stuff now when, you know, I have a younger kid, especially, and with my older son, I remember the same thing of like, you know, you're just not that discerning when you're 5. It's like, oh, I got to go to the movie theater and see something, right? And so I give myself a little bit of grace, but I will say my memory of it was that it was much funnier than it actually was, and like more entertaining than it was. And I didn't find it on rewatch to be either funny or entertaining really at all. I think there's one joke in it that I thought was kind of funny, and I think that's it, you know. And so um yeah, so it was pretty bad as far as a film. And I probably, somebody mentioned that it showed a lot on HBO back in the day, which I think is probably right. HBO, I think, is partly involved in the creation, like Orion Pictures, and they had a relationship with HBO and all of that. So I'm sure I also probably saw it, you know, kind of like segments of it on HBO when I was a little bit older again. But yeah, it just it ages like milk. I mean, that's what I will say about this film for sure. Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
I don't remember I mean, we must have watched it like in the late 80s. Probably rented it. I think as a kid, we went back to live in Mexico in like the mid 80s, and we came back around 87, 88. So it must have been around that time. And I imagine my parents were like, oh, there's like a Mexico themed movie that's PG, like let's watch it. And I remember, I mean, the things that I remember the most about it, I remember it being really funny. And now I was like a slog to get through. It was really difficult to get through. It took multiple viewings of me trying to stay awake. The Bandits cracked me up as a kid, and they cracked me up. I mean, that was like the one thing that still cracks me up for a variety of reasons. And we can maybe talk about like Alfonso Arau, like the El Guapo, like he actually is like a legit director and artist, like actor in Mexico during the quote unquote golden age cinema era, but then also in the US, right? Like he made the first NAFTA film, like Water for Chocolate, so which we can talk about. He's, I think, really fascinating as El Guapo, and the only funny parts are like involve him, and to me still in El Jefe. Like I mean, that's the parts that people remember. I like the plethora and the sweater, like I still think are kind of funny. But I think they're funny because of him too. Like he's like a big time actor who's was in a lot of famous movies in Mexico, and then later as a director. I mean, he's in U.S. famous westerns as well in the 60s and 70s. So it's interesting that they cast him to play that role, and like that's like the one redeemable, I think, for me, facet of the whole movie. But yeah, I remember it being extremely funny. I remember laughing at like the bush as a kid, and now just thinking like, what the hell? Like, why did I ever find? I guess as a kid, my parents didn't have the same restrictions that yours did, Jay. Like as a kid, we would go to watch. Like I remember going to watch Rambo and helping the Taliban. Like I remember going to the theater, and it was just like, and you know, we would. Alejandro talked about it on your RoboCop episode. We had 2 VCRs, so my dad would rent a movie and then record it so we could keep it. He got really mad when they started introducing the technology where like I think it was like Terminator 2 was the first one where he got really angry. He's like, what the hell? What's going on? It's like, yeah, you're you're a criminal, and you're upset that you're not allowed to do criminal things. So I grew up, you know, there was no, as long as there was no nudity, we could see as much violence as we wanted to, right? But Three Amigos stands out, one because of the Mexico theme, and I remember it being like super funny as a kid, which is obviously not rewatching it as an adult.
Yeah, for me, I watched a lot of these comedies, like the Steve Martin, Chevy Chase comedies. It was something that I watched, though this particular one was not one that like connected with me seriously. And I don't know why. It could just be like one of those accidents. Like it wasn't on that much when I would watch it. But my most distinct memory of it was I had a friend as a kid who was really into these comedies also, and for him the Three Amigos was like the hit that no one acknowledged was really the high level one. They were like, no, I know you like, you know, the Jerk or something like that, but no, the Three Amigos is the one, man, right? And I would go to his house and he would play it all the time, and he loved the opening song with the, you know, and he thought it was like the funniest thing in the world. And I remember being like, well, I guess I'm not that smart, right? Like I thought like maybe my comedy chops have not grown yet because I don't really get why this is funny. So I always looked at it as, when I was like a kid, as like this like highly elevated thing that like I would maybe grow into seeing it to be super funny. And then I didn't see it for a long time. And then I tried to watch it many years ago. And I kind of was like, I don't know if I really like this. This is not like really into it. But I don't think I actually finished it. I think it was like on cable or something. And I stopped watching it. So rewatching it this time, right? Like when I put it on, I was like, man, this is like really difficult. And I began to have all these questions just about Steve Martin and we'll talk about him, I think, as an actor. My Chevy Chase thing is been a while now. I have a real negative, and granted, I could still watch, not always. I could watch some of the National Lampoon's movies, though they bother me more now, like in a really big way. But I don't like Chevy Chase. I have like a real dislike of watching him. Martin Short, though, I will say I've always thought was a solid actor. And it's interesting, this is his first movie that I did not know until I watched it. I for some reason perceived that he had done more character stuff before this. But yeah, and then I get into this thing where I always wonder when they do these movies of white people going to see the ethnics, all of the ethnic actors. So what Alex was just talking about, El Guapo, it's funny because I wasn't as familiar with him, the actor, and I looked it up last night and I was like, whoa, wow, like look at this guy. And this happens, and I always have this curiosity of the kind of political economy that exists of these actors who have to do these things or choose to do these things, and this kind of social relationship that exists, and it's quite curious. So yeah, that's kind of where my brain went watching it. But as a work, I found it. It was hard to be offended because I was so bored. Right? Like I don't know if I had that real motherfucker moment, asshole moment, right? I was just like, oh bro, you lazy. This is just not good, right? Y'all are just, but then yeah, I mean, when we get into kind of talking about it more specifically, I have greater questions now about 80s comedy and this American comedy in general, and the purpose it serves. And why people also are so big in defending it. Because there's going to be hate. Be prepared. There's going to be hate. You know that.
Well, people already hate this show. We have haters at this point. You're like, you are destroying our classics. Like, what is wrong with you? You woke cancel culture, Yeah, no, people don't like it. I mean, and I guess I would say with regard to this is it's not. So I agree that a lot of those 80s comedies don't age that well, but I still will watch Christmas Vacation every year. I find it funny, and I know that it's problematic in all these ways, right? And it's, but so there are things from the 80s from a comedy perspective that even though I'm not endorsing all of the kinds of jokes or whatever, I still will watch them and I still find it funny. So, I don't, Chevy Chase is one of those people who's I would say the National Lampoon stuff is what I like most. I've never been a big fan of what is it, Funny Farm and Fletch and those kind of movies. And I knew people that were, but I just never found them that funny. But I do find I actually found him funny a few times in this movie, but it's really lazy. Like you said, it's not well constructed. So, I mean, I don't know. Any other thoughts, Alex? We can jump into kind of stuff about the film.
No, I think we can jump into it. I mean, we have a lot. There is actually a lot we can talk about. Right? We can talk about the border. The border becomes a theme in a bunch of 80s movies. There's some really wild border movies that start to come out in the 80s, right? And that's really the specter of the quote unquote illegal really takes off in the early to mid 1970s, and then it gets reflected in these movies in the 80s, both in subversive ways like Born in East LA, but then other ways as well, especially when it gets connected to with Red Dawn, right? You guys talked about it, it gets connected to imperial actions abroad, but the border between the US and Mexico is always cast as the soft underbelly of the US empire. And I think that's, I mean, it's interesting to think about why they would set this movie in 1916 in Mexico, because that's really the beginning in a way of the beginnings of our current U.S.-Mexico border, where it starts to become militarized and it starts to become heavily policed. It's also the year that like there was we can talk about the Zimmerman telegram because there's a German component to the movie, right? And there was an effort by the Germans to recruit Mexico into World War I on their side. So I think they're trying to speak to that as well. And 1916 is also the year that Pancho Villa invades the U.S. So the border plays, I think, a really interesting role in this movie, both in its context of production and the type of history that it's trying to tell. And then we can talk about a lot of other stuff, Westerns. I'm still fascinated by the idea that how they're identified at the beginning of the movie by the studio head, like as 3 Spanish landowners, I think is really interesting. That speaks to like a longer history of kind of whitewashing the history of Mexicans in lands that became the U.S. after the U.S.-Mexico War, particularly in a place like Los Angeles. I grew up in Central California, and we still had something called Fiesta Days, where this was supposed to be like towns in California that had a Catholic mission that had been set up in the late 1700s. You would celebrate like the history of Catholic missionary proselytizing, but they were always represented as Spanish, not Mexican. Like the Mexican period of California was always written out, and there was an effort to kind of just romanticize a Spanish past by the Americans who took over. And I think, most of that happens in LA, right? And that's the movie begins in LA. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about as well. But yeah, and then we can talk. I'm still like fascinated by Alfonso El Guapo because he's in some like iconic films that, and then he's really one of the first Mexican directors / actors who starts to come to the U.S. within this like broader NAFTA moment. So I think it's really interesting. Like he's in The Wild Bunch. Like that's like an iconic Western. And then he's in the craziest Western I've ever watched in my life is El Topo by Alejandro Jodorowsky. I don't know if you guys have seen. I highly recommend. Okay, I highly recommend everyone watch it, but be prepared for like the strangest thing you're ever gonna watch. And I didn't realize it until I read some stuff on that that he's actually in that movie. Jodorowsky in itself is just like a fascinating, weird, crazy dude. And El Topo they called it an acid Western. So everyone go watch it, but just be prepared. It's gonna be some weird shit, like really, really weird stuff. But it's within the genre of the Western, of like the kind of like the Yojimbo, like the lone gunfighter who's trying to save entire communities. It's just really, really weird. And Arau apparently is in it. I don't remember him in it. And it's hard to go back and watch that movie because you get this weird. I don't know if you watch it, Entume, but like when you watch it, you're uncomfortable the whole time. It's just like, I don't know how to describe it. You're just like, ugh.
Yeah, I mean,
you want to watch what happens.
Yeah, I've watched a lot of. I've seen every Jodorowsky film. I mean, The Holy Mountain, I think, is the other film that people are really familiar with his work, which I quite love that movie. I think it was incredible.
That's a great movie.
But yeah, he has a smaller. I don't know if it's a small role in the film. I need to go rewatch it, but I saw it and I was like, oh wow, he's in El Topo, and I was like, that's really, really wild, you know. Yeah, so you know what I think we should do? Let's do some like the grounding of like how the movie came about, and then kind of get that out the way, and then we can talk about you know, the things that we think are interesting to kind of like parse out from the actual film. So the film is in 86. It had like a longer like life, but it all really starts with Steve Martin. It was like Steve Martin's like initial idea. And the thing that Steve Martin, and I watched this interview that he did, and this is, I think, part of also the cult of the film, is he said he always wanted to make this film about people who like do a pretend thing and then they get popped into something that's real, right? He said he always wanted this idea, which I guess, I mean, people have credited as a trope that Three Amigos helped make into other movies like Galaxy Quest, and probably the most recent one is like Tropic Thunder, right? So it becomes like a comedy kind of trope in the movies. So he had like some early screenwriters, Lorne Michaels and people. Apparently the first script they didn't really like. It didn't really work out well, so they had to kind of rework it. Early actors who were supposed to do it are like people from like Dan Aykroyd, James Belushi, who, you know, ended up passing away before the film was made, was a person they thought John Candy was supposed to play it, but he had a thing because he didn't want to wear the suit. He said it was too restrictive, right? You know, and I John Belushi, sorry, James and John, I always get them confused. And then, yeah, and then, but they eventually settled on the well, really Chevy and Steve Martin kind of become like the anchors of the film. And it's important to state, like, by this time, Chevy Chase and Steve Martin were kind of like at the top of their like box office powers. Chevy's, I think Fletch is the year before, and people don't remember Fletch was a massive success. It's like a massive like success of a film. And it really kind of puts Chevy Chase into like this unique spot because he becomes what I've always heard in commentary around Chevy Chase is like he's leading man. He's like Cary Grant of comedy, right? It's like a kind of thing because he was supposed to initially be like a leading dramatic actor, but the comedy thing was something that he sought out, and it's like an interesting story. But there was a thing that people liked him. People thought he was attractive. He's tall. So he's the Cary Grant of comedy, right? And then Steve Martin, which I guess we could dig into a little bit more. You know, he comes from a really interesting space of, you know, he was doing like in the 70s what he said to be more like edgy experimental comedy and all that type of stuff, and that's kind of his thoughts. And you know, the Jerk had come out, Man with Two Brains, in these movies, and he's getting catapulted. So this is like a movie that's supposed to like, you know, hit their apex. Like you have these two big mega stars, and then Martin Short was suggested by John Candy as a replacement. And this was his first movie, and they bring him in, and this is like kind of solidifies what ended up for Steve Martin and Martin Short being a long career. And then the other persons, I mean, there's other people to mention I think are important, is John Landis. And, you know, John Landis is a director with like, I mean, I can name the movies even after this, Coming to America, lots of films that people like hold dear. My experience with Landis, though, I have to always say is like he's the white dude who does the colored pictures. I've always had that experience. I'm like, who's this white man who always does the colored folk movies, right? And I think that's a thing. You know, I don't know if he's ever been asked that question. Maybe he has, but it's part of it. But he is one of the premier like comedy film directors. I mean, if you just look at his, I mean, even other things like he directed Thriller, like the black and white video, like the guy is big. The other big thing with him, and it kind of floats into the movie, is when he directed the Twilight Zone, the movie, and there was a helicopter death in the film. 2 children, I think, and 3 actors died on the set. I mean, it's really brutal. What happened? If you read about it, go ahead, Jay.
I was just gonna say one of the kids is decapitated by the rotor of the helicopter.
That's what I mean. Like it's very brutal. Like to read it,
and also like the story from people on the set was like that. I mean, and this is where actually I think Tropic Thunder is actually trying to sort of connect to, like, Tropic Thunder is an interesting movie because it's actually in a similar way to this film, but much better, I would say, is critiquing a lot of real crap from Hollywood, like kind of dark stories from Hollywood. But he's the director who's like keeps telling them to do these explosions like closer and closer to the helicopter, and they do it. And I guess the flames from one of the explosion like burns the coating off of the propeller stuff, and that like causes it to fly out of control or whatever. And so he ends up being acquitted, but he's even as this movie is going on, he's on trial, and his trial lasted years.
Yeah, it lasted years. I mean, it went into the filming of this film to the point where he couldn't do the final edits of the film. So a lot of the things that are taken, the final edit is really not his own. And he sometimes like complains about like scenes that were taken out of it, even to attribute to why the film wasn't as successful as they would like. He's like, well, I think the studio kind of messed it up. There's even like rumors that like, I mean, it's so funny. Like I read an interview with all of them now, and they act real chummy. but there's lots of stories that like Chevy Chase made a couple jokes about it and Landis got pissed on set, right, about it, right? And then Chevy tries to backtrack, and Landis, I'm sure it happened. It seemed like Chevy Chase seemed like he would do some shit like that when Landis like did something he didn't like. So, it seems totally. But yeah, I mean, read about that case. I don't want to like go too much into it because it also did change a lot of things in Hollywood production. It was a huge like smear on Hollywood, and like if that were to happen now, like the media would like not stop. Like imagine what happened with the whole Alec Baldwin thing, right? This would have like 80 times larger, right? It would have been so everywhere. So you have that. HBO Pictures is the production company that helps make it, and then Orion, which has come up here with a couple films, RoboCop, is another and I think Rambo is Orion also, right? I think Rambo's Orion. I can't remember. They're part of the distribution of the film, right? And the film was definitely not successful. Like it was not a successful film, but like I said, it has a cult following that people really, really, attach themselves to. And I read this interview with the three actors and Landis, and like they see it as like this amazing thing that they did, like this like singular moment of American comedy, and they really like gush at the brilliance that they all displayed. And I find that very telling. I find that very telling about the kind of political unconscious that exists around a lot of this stuff. It's very, very interesting. I might read a couple quotes at some point. I have it here, so we'll go.
That'd be great. Yeah, I'm gonna say a couple of things just about like talk a little bit about Cedric Robinson and just so like one of the things that's interesting and why I compare it in some ways to Tropic Thunder, which you referenced too, Mtume, is that it starts off with like kind of an interesting scene, right, where you have the three amigos who are these silent film actors, right, who have been doing this series of movies basically where they are the characters that they play basically in this film, right? And they're going to the studio, right? And they call the studio Goldsmith Studios, which is very close to Goldwyn from Metro Goldwyn Mayer, which was Samuel Goldwyn, I believe, was his own studio in that kind of period, right? And like what Robinson talks about in Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, which I think is part of what they're actually trying to reference with this film, is that in the 19 teens, like really starting as early as 1908, but going through to like the 1920s or so, that there's a lot of work done by these kind of these young media moguls, these studio heads and so on, to demonize Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And it's like it is a big racializing, kind of film project. And a lot of what it has to do with, I know that Alex will share some thoughts on all of this, is like that they were really worried about revolution in Mexico. And so they were trying to make sure that American consciousness did not side with Mexican revolutionaries and with kind of the budding political project. One really important figure here is William Randolph Hearst. So Hearst in 1915 helped to finance a 15-part serial entitled Patria. The film depicted a Japanese-Mexican invasion of the United States and was clearly designed to capitalize on the nervousness many Americans felt over revolution in Mexico. So there's like, and William Randolph Hearst owned a lot of land in Mexico, and also the John D. Rockefeller and the Guggenheims. They saw Mexico as a potentially lucrative site for investment, exploitation, and further territorial appropriation. Texas and California had been seized in the mid 19th century. Hearst, for example, owned the huge hacienda of Babacora in Chihuahua, and in 1912 had urged the Taft administration to support the counter-revolution led by Pascual Orozco Jr. against Francisco Madero's government. So that's just like a little bit of a taste, but I just wanted to kind of contextual, like there's a potential, I think, for this movie to actually have done something really kind of cool with this history. And instead it like totally doesn't do anything really, that impressive. I mean, there's a little bit of a back and forth. They paint the head Flugelman as this kind of domineering studio head who boots them out because they ask for a raise, and he's like, you don't want to work for free. We give you clothes, we give you shelter, like you should be happy, and basically kicks them out of the mansion and takes their clothes away from them and kicks them out on the street. And that's how they receive a telegram in this moment from Carmen, right? A Mexican woman who has seen one of their movies and thinks that they will come save them from the evil El Guapo. So that's like just a little bit of the context, but I think it is important in terms of like there was a potential to talk about this studio history. Like you bring it up, you're intentionally kind of referencing this period where they're making these films as a part of a political project that's really an imperial political project. And yet again, like it never really, I mean, certainly the three amigos are kind of these bumbling, white, gringos, right, going down, but it still doesn't have any real critique of like the kind of imperial project ideologically or politically in the film. So anyway, that's just a little bit. I'll go ahead, Alex, take it away.
Let me add
Go
one
ahead.
quick thing to that I forgot. And then, yeah. So the other thing is Martin said he specifically wanted to make a Western. And he said he grew up watching them. So he wasn't specific in anything that I read with what kinds of Westerns, but I can't help but think he's thinking about Zapata Westerns and spaghetti Westerns doing this. But what I find curious about it is even if you watch something like Duck You Sucker is a very pro Mexican Revolution film. Right, it is very pro the well, actually, you're correct. There's a way that I find Leone to be, I agree with you. He has a way that I do agree. I see your head shake, and I said this in a review once that he kind of disparages revolution as a kind of thing that's like an idealism that can never actually happen. So I do agree with you. And then, but even like a movie like A Bullet for the General, right? These kinds of ideas of like, you would have these things. So I find it interesting that Martin, I think he's somewhat referencing that, and then how he wants to kind of zip that into this new kind of flavoring here. But also, I think it speaks to these comedy guys wanting to kind of be like those actors in the way that they want to be, right? In the way that they can be. And it's like them living a new fantasy. And that's something I wanted to add, because I think that kind of adds to them wanting to reference these things, but why they have no possibility of a real critique, because it's about what they liked as kids. And they're now these famous actors, and they get to kind of live their wet dream of being, a Western guy, I mean, they were saying, oh, doing Westerns is the best. And it was like this weird fantasia that they had, but I'll leave it there.
Last point, but yeah, so it's the studio refers to the three amigos as, what people love about the three amigos is that they're three wealthy Spanish landowners who fight for the rights of peasants, right? And that is also a scene later on where Steve Martin is like being taken to a dungeon, and he's like extolling the virtues of private property relations to the captors too, right? So like those are like two of the brief moments where you're like, oh, there's a little something here, but it's so minor. Go ahead.
Well, he has that scene in the bar where he's like, we're not Mexican. So he makes it like very clear, right? It's their American actors playing Spanish landowners, but they're definitely not Mexicans, even though they're movies. And it's interesting, the studio part, it's a question over creative control, right? Because the reason why they were there is their previous movie, they had gone to like New York or Manhattan, and it just kind of like, and that movie flopped. So the studio head is like, no, we want you to go back to what you guys are successful doing, which is going back to Mexico, doing the Western. And that's, you know, they didn't want to do that. I will say, so Cedric Robinson, that stuff you read, Jay, it's really interesting about Cedric Robinson. I mean, it's not surprising that William Randolph Hearst was doing actual like supporting actual counter-revolutionary work in Mexico during the 1910s, because I think he actually was the single largest foreign landowner in the country, or if not, like definitely top 3. That hacienda he owned in Chihuahua, which was also like one of the ground zero for one of the more radical of the revolutionary movements led by Pancho Villa. And then that fact that he's doing the media aspect, the media counterinsurgency. I mean, he did that during the Spanish-American War, right? So it's no surprise. But you get the dichotomy in that moment, and it continues throughout films in the 20th century and even to today, where it's okay. So if the Mexican is the bandit or the evil person who transgresses borders and is always a threat or a menace to the United States, the other possibilities, they can be the noble savage. So like you actually had at the peak of his military power, Pancho Villa, who was the head of the Northern Peasant Revolutionary Movement, he had like a 40,000 plus peasant army, hundreds of rail trains at his disposal. He even had like an air force. He had like 6 biplanes that were with foreign pilots. And he actually had Mutual Film Company guys like with him recording filming his battles and filming like what he was doing, and then sending the reels back to the US in the form of news reels. And like that made him into like this larger than life, revolutionary, radical, but noble savage. And then you also had John Reed, the famous, you know, socialist American writer, actually travel to Mexico and like hang out and live with Pancho Villa and his men, his fighters. And it's a great, I mean, it's a book of its time, but I think it's a really good book called Insurgent Mexico. And it really portrays Pancho Villa as that like a noble savage, but like a revolutionary socialist one. And then, you know, John Reed will become famous because he goes to write about the Bolshevik Revolution, but he like was in Mexico first writing about Pancho Villa. So you get like the bandit or you get the noble savage. There's a really terrible movie that comes out in the late 20s, early 30s about Pancho Villa with like Wallace Berry plays. And it's like, it's a combination of, it's like a combination of both, but like Pancho Villa is like a Fred Flintstone type character, like a really stupid Fred Flintstone, like just, it's a horrible movie. But it shows kind of how far Pancho Villa's star had dropped, right, in the views of American viewers. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that he invaded the U.S. in 1916. Hundreds of his troops crossed the border and attacked Columbus, New Mexico, as part of this grand plan to get the U.S. to invade Mexico and get the U.S. embroiled in a quagmire, and that would elevate Pancho Villa's status once again. And that really that destroyed his stock with like the American populace, right? Then he was seen as this like evil menace bandit. And if you look at like political cartoons of that moment, he's represented as a snake. He's represented as like your quintessential Mexican bandit who's running around barefoot, unshaven, with a beard and guns, you know, killing Americans. And that kind of sets the scene for the U.S. actually invading Mexico in 1916 and hanging out for a few months, chasing Pancho Villa around, even though they were never able to catch him, and eventually they were forced to leave. And there's this famous quote that's attributed to Pancho Villa where he's apparently watching the Americans led by General Pershing, Jack Pershing, who ends up leading American forces in World War I. He's leaving Mexico with his troops. His troops included people like Patton and Eisenhower, which is interesting. And Pancho Villa supposedly said something like, they came like eagles and they left like wet hens, which is, I hope he said that because I think that's pretty dope. But it's a moment of revolution. I think Robinson is right, though, to talk about how there was an effort from the American side to how to contain or prevent the contagion of revolution from crossing from Mexico into the United States. And this is why you start to get tens of thousands of U.S. military personnel stationed along the U.S.-Mexico border as an effort to prevent that contagion. Because they did fear the spillover effects of the first great social peasant revolution of the 20th century globally. Like the Mexican Revolution was the first one. And then you also had Mexican revolutionaries running around in the U.S., like anarcho-syndicalists like the Flores Magón brothers, who are running around organizing in places like Los Angeles, border cities. They're producing their own radical newspaper. And Kelly Lado Hernandez has a great book called Bad Hombres, where she talks about how you essentially get the rise of the FBI and the U.S. security surveillance state in reaction to chasing Mexican bandits and revolutionaries like the Flores Magón brothers around the southwestern United States. And him and his movement also had ties to like the Wobblies, had ties to what's the name of the miners union in Colorado, United Mine Work. I can't remember. Anyway, they had all sorts of links with other U.S. based radical labor organizations that also kind of freaked out the U.S.
Yeah, just one more quote I wanted to read from Robinson. These are all from Forgeries of Memory and Meaning too, for folks if they want to dig into his kind of analysis, which is much more than what I'm sort of reading here. But he says the social base of the peasant-dominated 1910 revolution was the largest threat to American capital. Consequently, it is understandable if the film industry distinguished between a white, virtuous Mexican aristocracy and a darker, villainous peasantry. And he goes into like all of this stuff too around how this is part of his argument around the racialization in these films, right? And it's very obvious in this film that we're going to talk about too, is like the kind of, the Mexicans are all dirty in the film, right? They're like all of the banditos, right, are all like bearded, and their teeth are all like really filthy, right? Like looks like somebody just took like a Sharpie and like drew stuff on their teeth kind of. And there's this real like effort to, and Robbins also talks about like Mexican Americans within the film industry, that if they were white, right, they could play anything basically. But if they were darker skinned, like it had to be this sort of negative criminal element only. And so it's one of, along with him looking at blackface and like, early representations of Black people in Hollywood, it's like one of the primary racialization projects he looks at through Forgeries of Memory and Meaning in that very early Hollywood period, after the turn of the century. So.
Yeah, and it sets it for like the rest of the Westerns in the 20th century, right? Like you had Italian actors or white actors always playing the role of Mexicans, right? And it's the same thing. It's the dirty, it's the, apparently they didn't believe in oral hygiene. I mean, even like Duck You Sucker, right? Like Duck You Sucker, it's a lot of non-Mexican actors playing Mexican characters, right? And I actually I'm teaching a class on the Mexican Revolution this semester, and I always show the beginning of Duck You Sucker because it starts with that Mao's quote about revolution. It's like revolution is not a dinner party. So you watch this and you're like, oh, this is going to be like a very pro-revolution Western about the Mexican Revolution. And then it turns into something else. I think Mantume described it exactly. It's Leone's, for him, this is like revolution is like an impossible utopia. It always ends in the same way. And there's like a pessimism built into the movie, even though the movie itself, it's my favorite Western. And the idea that you have like an IRA revolutionary from Ireland who escapes to Mexico and teaches these Mexican revolutionaries how to like build bombs. And I mean, it's some great scenes. It's not very effective in class because I think my students tend to like just zone out with those long like Leone scenes, right, when he sets the landscape and the music. My students are like, they can't take it. But yeah, so that's another thing that continues to this day, right? There's actually a relatively good movie that HBO put out maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s about the Mutual Film Company following Pancho Villa around. It's called And Starring Pancho Villa, but the guy that they picked to play Pancho Villa is, I hate, it makes me so angry. It was Antonio Banderas. So every time in the 90s and 2000s, when you need a leading Hollywood male actor to play a Mexican, they go to Spain and they pick Antonio Banderas, right? Like in the Mariachi trilogy too, right? Like the original Mariachi movie, it's a Mexican actor. Robert Rodriguez hits it with that one. He does the sequel, Desperado, and they don't keep the same actor. They bring in Antonio Banderas. It's like, oh my God. He's an honorary Mexican, I guess, at this point, because of all the roles that he's played. But so, yeah, it's interesting that Robinson traces this back to the 1910s in the midst of the revolution.
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to Gian Maria Volante, who played the villain in the first two with Fistful of Dollars, all those films, right? There's those two, the first two. And they also did Bullet for the General, but then later became known as like this kind of very leftist actor when he did things like Z and movies like that. Not Z, movies in that kind of genre, right? But he talked about that. He said he said he did those movies as an actor early on, Italian, but he said he felt it was horrible. He hated it, and he hated Leone for doing it. Yeah, he was very, very, because Leone wanted him to be in Duck You Sucker, and he refused. By that point, he had already made his new career, right, as like doing these like Marxist, inspired films, right, or movies like Operation Ogro about the people who did the assassination, which I love.
They created the first Spanish astronaut. Those guys. Yeah, that's a great movie.
Yeah. Which is the running joke that always comes out of Boss Country on that one. Yeah.
That can get you in prison in Spain. So
yes,
we're saying it from the safety of the U.S.
From the U.S. exactly. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, to add that note, now the film, starting in that is interesting because they're playing with a lot of tropes in this movie, and that's the one thing that I realized when I was watching it, right? So even the studio system thing is a trope because it's 1916, and they're not really specific on how, because really the Big Five starts in that year. Paramount is like the first Big Five studio to kind of form, and then you have everything. You had studios, you had tons of small ones. I also do find it funny that they have Joe Mantegna playing the studio head, so this idea is like it's like pushy Italian kind of vibe to it. Like they're playing with tropes and like moving things around that like don't always feel equal, and it's like these three waspy guys, and this like pushy Italian looking dude is the one who's like it is like giving like the kind of like the gangsterish vibe that I find very interesting. But then the other kind of big thing is so that they start, because the first thing you do see is Carmen, right? And when I was watching the film is like is this unintelligent primitivism, right? The fact that she can't recognize that these three people are actors, like I couldn't not suspend my disbelief. Because if anyone's going to be able to actually realize these people are fakes, it would be her, right? It literally would be her. She would literally see, what is this? Oh, what is this bullshit coming from the United States, right? This idea that she would not be able to tell the difference, right? To me is absolutely ludicrous, right? But it's this concept of, the unintelligent primitive. But then it's juxtaposed, and I think this is where I always have issues with people who defend these comedies, because they say, well, they're making fun of everybody, right? Because they use the uncultured idiot. The white person is the uncultured idiot, right? And they really play with it, right? The fact that they can't tell that they're being brought there to not do a kind of recreation of like the stuff that they do in the movies live, and the fact that it takes them so long, like halfway through the movie, really, to realize that they're not in a movie set thing. They're actually in an actual battle, right? And the fact that they have all these like cultural faux pas, right? Chevy Chase is constantly like getting the things wrong that they're saying. They don't know how to like, interact with them and so forth and so on. They think that the kind of uncultured idiot trope like saves this. But really, the thing that I always find that people never really accept about the whole uncultured idiot thing is that it's sent to make them charming, right? The idiot, right? Because if you're an idiot in that kind of way, you're essentially like good-natured, right? You have this kind of good nature to you. So it's like the white male wet dream to be the uncultured idiot, right? I'm uncultured. I go in there, but I have a heart of gold, which they then really transition to when Martin Short, decides that, we really need to be real revolutionaries and defend these people who can't be defended by anyone else, right? These three white guys have to go kind of fulfill that mission, right? And they find their own virility doing that. But this is the total wet dream. But that, to me, is literally based on a completely racist way of thinking. It's just so... And the film really is largely built around that scope. And that's what I think struck me this time, right? How they use the uncultured idiot to allow themselves to do these racist primitivism tropes, right? And this is what you constantly see through the narrative of people. They constantly just say, well, look, they're making fun of everybody. But I said, yes, but the making fun that you're doing of these three is actually giving them pass, right? You're actually making them endearing, right? And that's where it all gets really funky and why I have such trouble accepting watching these things.
No, I think that's a really good point, because there's no movie without that, right? Like it's more insulting than like the Magnificent Seven, right? Like there, it's just like a straight up, like there's a paternalism built into it, right? There's obviously like a racist depiction of the Mexican villagers who went out and tried to like get these mercenaries to defend them. But that's, to me, that's not as bad as what you just described them to me. Like, so, and without what you just described, there is no Three Amigos. Like, how do you make this into a comedy then, right? I mean, there are other ways, right? Like I was sending messages to Jay, like Blazing Saddles is a way to like kind of present, to kind of poke holes in tropes of the Western in a way that can be more subversive and not do what like the Three Amigos did. Because if you don't have the uncultured idiot, and then if you don't have like the racist depiction of the Mexican women who can't discern reality from representation, there is no movie here, right? There's nothing. You're going to get like a really like low rent version of like that Magnificent Seven. No one wants that, right? Like, so I think I hadn't really thought about that, but that's precise. You don't have a movie without that. And I think that makes it really bad. Like it makes it worse. So now I really hate it.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that, I think you brought it up, Alex, earlier on. It was either you or Mtume who brought up the idea of the noble savage, right? Which, I think about another book that we did a talk on, which was the How to Read Donald Duck, and like it has this whole section on, the role of the noble savage, right? But it's the same. It's all these kind of things, these ideas of this sort of innocent being close to nature, right? The village that they go to, like everybody is kind of like it's all fine, until El Guapo shows up. And this is one of the interesting things about the film too, because there are all these cuts that were made, like you said, to me, and some of that stuff is out there, and it's not that what was deleted like adds a lot to it. Like it's not, but it does add certain things contextually. Like, but one of the things that it adds, which I don't think is in the official version, is the first time that El Guapo goes to um, the village to like extort them, basically, and and they kind of resist, right? Um, but because I think in the film it just starts with her, right, going to the telegraph office, right, to ask for help, right? She sees the movie, one of the movies that they are in, right, and then she goes. And that's one of the things that's weird about the cuts that are made, is actually it takes out a lot of context. Like for instance, also the studio boss gets pissed because they're making fun of his girlfriend, which is something that you don't find out. Like they sort of make fun of this actress in that scene, but you don't know that he has a relationship with her in that scene, because they cut that part out. And actually she's played by Fran Drescher, right? So they cut out all the Fran Drescher scenes from the film. So there's just kind of things like that where the edits sort of create a lack of knowledge that actually might help contextualize things a little bit. It doesn't make the film necessarily better, but I think it would help it a little bit be more narratively cohesive at times. But yeah, back to the kind of noble savage thing. I mean, so the village is all presented as like they can't defend themselves, right? So you have to get these three Hollywood actors to come and defend yourself, right? And it's I mean, there's a lot of issues with it, but I think that the portrayals of the village actually are as racist as the portrayals of the banditos are. Like it's just kind of an inverse. And the only thing that's interesting is that Steve Martin's trying to convince them that they need private property relations as the solution to their problem. But like, you know, again, it's just like a line, so it's not enough to actually like drive that point home to the point where it would actually be really funny, I think, if it was really like let's really critique, American capitalism and our fascination with private property as the solution to all problems. But again, it can't go there, right? So anyway.
I mean, that's why there's a revolution. That's the funniest to me. Like, there's a revolution because peasants have had their land taken away by the Spanish, large landowners since like the 1870s.
Yeah, like they don't have a critique of liberal democracy already.
Right. Yeah, they only
I'm like,
decided to launch a mass revolution to, yeah, no.
right. Like that would have been the joke. He's like walking them down.
Yeah.
Like, and if people haven't seen it, there's a scene of him literally walking down as they're taking him into jail, and he's like giving them like the beauty of liberal democracy. And I was like, no, the joke would then be one of them going up and just giving him the total revolutionary read of why liberal democracy is a sham. But
or someone like Zapata would have been like, we give him the revolutionary chop. I mean, the Mexican guillotine was a machete, right? That's what Zapata or Villa would have said. But I think you brought up a really interesting point, Jay, and I hadn't thought about it, but I did see it written somewhere. So we could use How to Read Donald Duck in this situation because the Three Amigos are based on like to a certain extent, the Three Caballeros, right? That Disney film that like is the center of Ariel Dorfman's book. So it's just the difference there, right? It's like there's three nationalities that are supposed to represent Latin America and the U.S. coming together because in the 30s and 40s, they're good neighbors, and the U.S. needs Latin American, raw natural resources and diplomatic and maybe even a little bit of military support to wage World War II. And that's why you get the Donald Duck, Pancho Pistolas, who's like the Mexican, and he looks like a bandit, right? Pancho Pistolas looks like a bandit, and the Brazilian bird looks, I mean, his look, Carioca, is really interesting, right? It says something about how the U.S. imaginary, about how they think about Brazil, not black at all. Which is right because the way that they represent the Brazilian bird, but then Pancho Pistolas is the spicy Mexican with always shooting off his guns and like looking like quasi bandido, no?
Yeah, and your point on Brazil is really important. Like I rewatched this morning because of the reference, and there are no black people in Bahia. Like not one. Like it's all it's an entirely white cast.
Yes. In the country that's positing itself as a multiracial democracy, like throughout the 20th century, Brazil says we are the paradigm of like multiracial democracy. That's what they're saying about themselves. And then what the US sees about them it's a totally different thing, right? They just erase, at least in this Disney production, they like erase the entire, in a place like Bahia, which is unbelievable, right? I mean, that's a really good point.
Where do we want to go next?
I was trying to look up some of the
you got some quotes, right?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, like even here, there's a quote from Landis. He writes, he says, talking about the film, it was also great getting to homage vintage westerns. We shot the silent movie sequence on the oldest exterior set at Universal Studios, built from a Tom Mix film. The tourist trams go through it every 10 minutes, and the boys would shoot their 6 guns and dance for them. Chase says, another great one was the campfire scene. Short, when the horses start singing, I remember walking onto the sound tent and seeing the magnificent painted backdrop. It went on forever. Martin, it was lit beautifully, and there were live animals all over the set. Chase, it looked real. I mean, they gush at this. It's like these movies and this period for them represents a kind of height and idealized America. And it's funny because I don't remember who said it. A film historian says you have to look at the 80s as a kind of a reconservativism of American films after the 70s, which kind of played with certain things. I'm not saying it was truly radical, but the way, if anything, like the nihilism that exists in the 70s, they wanted to get rid of that in the 80s movie, right?
Yeah, like Peckinpah's movies, right? Like that.
Yeah,
they wanted to get rid of that. Yeah.
Yeah, but even the 70s being focused on things that are happening in the city, something like the French Connection, which have these thoughts, and we have to go back to the kind of frontier attitude, right? And this kind of thing, right? The 80s was like a recentering, which then makes sense because of the Cold War, right? And this is Cold War logic, and like I think people could quickly miss how a movie like The Three Amigos still lives in Cold War logic in that way. They have to re-represent, as they're in this kind of ideological battle, the kind of great histories that they have. And using the actor in this kind of way is very interesting, because these three actors become the kind of, idealistic, form. Like, so like in the film, it's interesting. I found it interesting that Martin Short ends up being in a way the most heroic, right? I mean, there's two scenes. He's the one who sets the line. So he literally says it, right? Like, men are mice, right? When they're Chevy and Steve Martin are kind of like, I think we got to kind of dip out of it. And he's like, no, I'm going to really do this, right? And, he sets the line and they join, and then they decide to kind of go off into this mission to kind of help people and live what they are pretending to be. But the other one is he's the one who gets to shoot the gun and beat the German. Right. Which actually, that scene, I actually say, like, that actually is a funnily like dealt with scene. I thought, like, the part with him with the big gun. I mean, it's where Martin Short is just a good actor. And I don't know if I want to go on this tangent right now, but like, I have an acting comment in general, but you can see where he's a good actor because he's really playing with the gun, and he shoots him, and he's the one who kind of always kickstarts the highest level. He kind of brings Steve Martin and Chase into this kind of this position that they're going to really reach their full potential. And what is their full potential? Stopping these bandits from taking these small townspeople. And this is where you kind of get into how to read Donald Duck, because one of the things that Dorfman also talks about is the idea that you go into these peripheral lands, right, to kind of find yourself, right? And so when you come back to the metropolis, you're now ready to kind of deal with it, right? And you see this in a lot of movies like Romancing the Stone, even like Crocodile Dundee's a twist on it in a way too. Like it's a big theme of this time of, right, the peripheral lands or these like rough places. But we from the metropolis need to go there to kind of, not we, I say white people, need to go out there and to find themselves and then come back. And you're now imbued with a new level of virility to deal with the problems of the metropolis, because you've now, really found yourself, which is like, I guess early Eat, Pray, Love, or it's male Eat, Pray, Love. Right?
That, I mean, Roosevelt. Right, that's
right.
Teddy from that moment, that earlier imperial moment of the 1880s, 1890s, linking it to the 80s. Right, I mean, that's what Teddy Roosevelt was writing about and preaching as a virtue for all white, middle class bourgeois American males who, according to him, were becoming too effeminate because of industrial capitalism. Right, so how do you regain your virility or your martial masculinity? Well, you go and be an imperialist. So you find yourself doing imperialist shit in Cuba, in the Philippines, 34 times in Latin America between 1900 and the early 1930s, right? So it's interesting to think about that being repurposed in the 80s, where it's a reactivation at the very least of those ideas during the Reagan administration. Not necessarily in practice, even though they obviously did some really horrific covert stuff. And then they ended up, well, after Reagan, right, they do end up invading Panama, but it's still like a similar logic. It's always the linking of white imperial masculinity in a moment of crisis. Like, how do we resolve that crisis? Well, we go and find ourselves abroad and be imperialist to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think, I guess a couple other, I don't even know, man. This movie sucks. Like, I just, like, it's so bad. Like, I'm like, oh, can we talk about this? It's like, I don't even want to talk about this movie. I have to be honest. Like, it's just bad. The Martin Short. So let's talk about the Germans. So like, so you get I guess a couple of plot points for people who haven't seen it. Don't watch it. It's not worth it. You'll hate yourself if you watch it. And you'll be mad at us. Again, they get the telegram. So they get kicked out of the studio. They get a telegram that says they can get 100,000 pesos if they go save the town of Santa Poco, which comes from Carmen and her son. And so they go down there because they're broke, right? And they think that they're so dumb that they think that they don't have to fight anybody. They don't know what infamous means. They think it means more famous. And so they go down there and they're gonna, do this. They think a show, right, to fight El Guapo and get a bunch of money. And they get down there, and I guess the one of the first scenes is kind of weird. They go into this bar. Well, a couple Germans go in before them, right? That's the way it goes. And or the one German guy goes in before them. And he like somebody looks at him wrong basically, and he kills like 3 people or whatever. And says like the next guys that come in here, you better treat them, way better than you treated me, or they're going to kill all of you basically. And so then it's the 3 amigos who come in afterwards. Of course, it's not his German friends, and they do My Little Buttercup, which again, like, this is so stupid. Also, I don't think we mentioned Randy Newman is one of the co-writers of this, and so he wrote all the songs. He's the guy who did You Got a Friend in Me from Toy Story, right? So it's the same dude. But the point being just that there's this weird thing early on of like, why are the Germans in Mexico? And then they show up later on, and Dusty eventually flies, right? Like, isn't that like a German Red Baron kind of plane or whatever? So there's this World War I connection. I think you already referenced it, Alex. I don't know if there's anything more you want to say about that, but it's also just, I think, the 80s is still this time period where they love to show not, Germans as Nazis, basically, even though it would be a little bit anachronistic here because you're talking about World War I politics, not World War II. But the, they have that kind of like, Nazi vibe to them nonetheless. And so I think it's just a shot, another attempt to take a shot at the Germans. But
I would just say that it's part of border anxiety, right? So the reason why there was Germans in why Germany would figure in Mexico in 1960, 1970 is that there was a German foreign minister, I think it was Foreign Minister Zimmerman, who had this idea to try to convince Mexico to join the World War I on the side of Germany. And if Mexico did that and invaded the US, then Germany would give Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico back to the Mexicans. And then part of this crazy plan was Mexico was also supposed to try to convince Japan to come into their side. There's like a pretty substantial amount of Japanese capital invested in Mexico right before the World War, right before the Mexican Revolution blew up, 1910, 1911. This plan was put into a telegram that was like sent from Germany to the Americas, and it was actually intercepted and decrypted by the British. And then the British ran to the Americans and said, "Hey, look what we just found." And that played a pretty significant role in finally convincing Woodrow Wilson to get the U.S. entangled to enter World War I. But it's part of that idea, right? That Mexico is going. It's an anxiety that goes back to like the U.S.-Mexico War that resulted in Mexico losing half of its national territory to the U.S. The U.S. knows they did something that they probably shouldn't have done. Like, so there's always this idea that Mexico is going to try to reconquer it in some way. And that idea, I mean, it still exists in like certain right-wing quarters in the U.S., right? The idea that like the Mexicans that are here are going to try to reconquer the Southwest and take it back to Mexico. But in this situation, that's why there's a German connection to Mexico in 1916, 1917.
So I want to read a couple things like from the actors again, because like this kind of goes into something that I kind of want to say about the film, and it also brings back to what I was talking about, like the lovable idiot, because they pretty much talk about it. Landis, the question that they were asked was finally, why do people still love the Amigos? Landis, it may be because the 3 of them are just so lovably dumb. I saw the movie yesterday and it really made me laugh. The silly stuff, like when one of them says, "We're going to have to use our brains," and the other 2 go, "Damn." Martin, It's a funny, silly comedy. It just works. And by the way, I have to give John a lot of credit. You recognize that these were sweet characters and directed in that direction. You allowed that to happen. That scene where we all sleep together in the same bed, it's so Laurel and Hardy. Short, I actually think it was a little ahead of its time. That kind of comedy is in vogue now. Chase, it plays off the Western concept of us being heroes, but in fact, we're just doofuses. We're just actors. It's a mistake that's made clear in the beginning, but we're not in on it. So one of the things that I think that kind of proves like the older point that I was kind of making. If I had to talk about like cinematically, the reason why I find, the film, I really struggled with it because the film does not have really strong discernible characteristics outside of like gags, right? And when I was watching it, and I think this is my struggle with like watching Steve Martin, and then ultimately what Chase would have to do is they always had to kind of play up the funny, right? Like Steve Martin has to constantly like add an affectation. So I was watching the movie and I was going, now I realize why they were all so afraid of Eddie Murphy in the 80s. Because Eddie did not have to do affectation. He literally could play the role and it would be funny, right? Martin has to do all these like extra little things to kind of say, hey, it's time to be funny now, right? And it's just bad. And like even Chevy has to do like some of the eyes things that happen or like make these extra little things. And like Eddie did not have to do that. And I'm watching the film and I'm seeing them attempt to try to upplay everything. But then I also go, I'm like, well, why? Like, why is this a thing that became so big in these comedies, right? Like, why? And I always kind of fall back on that. This was a period where there was a lot of actors trying to kind of like make a statement about how great everything was and how amazing we were. And they really did not have much else to kind of sit on. And that's why I think it also kind of ages very poorly, because unless you were kind of in on the period and kind of in on the kind of zeitgeist of it, and you have a nostalgia for that zeitgeist, it doesn't really have much to grab onto. There is no like craft work that you're watching that you're going, damn, that's really well done. I mean, even the shooting is pretty boring, right? The visual comedy is, they try to go heavily on slapstick. There's a scene where that they go for like, I think at least 10 minutes in a back and forth shot of Steve Martin, maybe even longer, of being chained up. And it's just not funny. It's just not funny. And he's trying so hard to like push for a joke. And I'm like, it's not funny, right? I see you forcing a joke and I'm not laughing, And yeah, I mean, that's something that I wanted to say, because like when I was like watching the film, I was like, why does this as a piece of cinema, comedic cinema, it just doesn't work? And it's like they're trying to force feed us into believing that this is something that we must really hold in high reverence. And that just to me is like very much of like the unconscious or conscious of the 80s, right? There was an uncomfortability. Alex, you've pointed out a lot of it. You too, Jay, of like where we were in the social world. I think it's hard for people because we know about all the destructions that would happen like in the next like 4 to 5 years, right? By like that time, people still didn't necessarily believe that, America was going to win this thing. Right? That's why we're at the brink of nuclear war. I mean, at some point, we have to do some of these nuclear war films. These like nuclear Holocaust movies that like were really prevalent at the time, because there was not necessarily a consciousness that we were going to win. So they were really uncomfortable. And I see this film and I see that uncomfortability. Like they really need to let us know that, like, gotta believe, guys. And I'm like, well, you seem a little unsure of yourself.
Yeah. I mean, like in terms of, there are some moments of the film that I do find slightly funny. Like one is the scene where Chevy Chase is talking. It's not Carmen. It's another woman character, and she's like trying to get him to kiss her, right? And he's like, not. He's like, well, what now? Kind of thing. And she's like, we can take a walk, and you can kiss me on the veranda. And he's like, lips would be fine. That was the only Like that got a laugh out of me. I'm like, oh, I didn't get that as a kid for sure. I was probably like, Mom, what's a veranda? Ah, man. But yeah, it's just like there are a couple of those dry moments for Chevy that I kind of laughed or thought were mildly funny, and a couple of those like you said, Martin Short, with some of the physical stuff, but Steve Martin is just very bad in this movie, and I think that the fact that he wrote it, and I also think it's like I think this is the only Hollywood movie that Lorne Michaels ever wrote. Like Lorne Michaels has been a writer on stuff, but it's always just like if you go to his IMDb page, it's all SNL stuff. Like it's not just like cast members of SNL doing a movie like this, but it's like usually like the SNL at 40, the SNL at 25, like these kinds of things. It's so he's not a film writer. And I think it's just interesting, right? That you have two people who a lot of folks, especially white Americans, would consider like comic geniuses in some regard. And like it's just very poorly written, I think, as a comedy film. And I kind of go back through Steve Martin's catalog, and it's really hard for me to find movies where I'm like, that was actually really funny. Like there are movies I remember that my parents liked, but they were never to me like laugh out loud kind of funny movies. It's just sort of like him being this awkward guy, it feels like is sort of his thing. Um so yeah, I don't know. That was I at least agree that it's not well written, directed, or executed really in terms of even and the jokes are just not that funny.
I find Steve Martin is best when he doesn't need to be funny. That's the only time I've watched him. Like in Parenthood, he's good. Right? There's a scene. There was a movie about, and I actually think sometimes he would have been a better dramatic actor. There's a movie. He has a small scene on it. It's about the AIDS crisis. And he has a scene in it where he plays like the brother of someone who's died of AIDS. And he's very good in it. Right. And he's good in these kinds of things. When he needs to be comedy, man, it's like, bro, just stop. It just stop. But I think it speaks to, but there's people who love him. And this is where I'm gonna start psychoanalyzing folks. And maybe I should push back. I think it's kind of what I was getting to was that I think he speaks for a certain section of our society that wants to kind of have that like strength and domineering, but they can't. They're awkward. So they like that about him, right? Because so they get to fit too. And I think, and that's kind of what I was saying. Like they get to, they can't be Mel Gibson, right? Right. But they want in on the project. So we got this new lane for y'all, these weird comedy dudes, right? And you're still getting these kinds of movies. I mean, because like, there's other movies like things like Spies Like Us, all these other kinds of movies that come out in the period that we'll probably cover that, do the same shit, right? Even some of the smaller teen movies about like going to Europe, and then I forget the one movie with the guy from ER where he's like the guy who goes to Europe and then he becomes a secret agent trying to fight East Germany or some shit, right? Things like that. These are like really big tropes, and they do them in these kinds of comedies, but they want even the nerd or even the awkward person to be able to kind of get down on this Imperial project, because we're all going to need everybody, we need everybody.
I like that. I like that. I hadn't thought about it that way. I mean, I think like John Candy, I think is really funny, and then Martin Short, I do think was really funny. But they're both Canadian, right? So I think it's like a different variety of white that like is actually funny during the 1980s, maybe. But also like I'm thinking about what you guys have said about the bad writing and like Steve Martin not being funny because it feels so forced. Like I also grew up watching like Police Squad and Naked Gun, and like those like the one example of like a white American comedian that I still laugh at. Like I still laugh at Leslie Nielsen, right? Like, but the writing's better. Like they're corny jokes, like double entendre, but like it's still better than what we watch in Three Amigos. Like I still laugh watching Naked Gun, like probably too much. Like I enjoy Leslie Nielsen way too much, right? But compared to this, it's like yeah, that joke, Jay, was one, and then like just Alfonso Arauz, some of his stuff. But other than that, like I didn't really laugh. It's just like, what are we doing?
Yeah, Arao plays it so earnestly. I do, and I think that's what's good. Like he's so happy when they give him the sweater. Like he's just so like, and they all play it really well. Like, cause you're like, what are they about to give him? 'Cause I couldn't remember the sequence. I was like,
Yeah.
and I thought it would be something really crass and
Yeah.
crude. Then they give him the sweater, and
Yeah,
he's just
I
like,
thought-
yeah.
that and like the scene where the plethora scene, right, where the El Jefe is like psychoanalyzing him, like as to why he's really upset and taking it out on him. Like I thought that was, and Tony, I think what's his name, Tony Plana, I think, like he's like old, like he's been around forever, right, in movies and in TV. Like I think he's a really cool actor. I thought that was really funny, right? He's psychoanalyzing El Guapo, and El Guapo's just like, yeah, you're right. Yes, this is, that's why I thought those parts were funny. But yeah, other than that, it's just there isn't stuff there to like laugh at.
Yeah, one of the scenes that one scene is when, so like towards the end, right after you talked about the scene where, well, this is before, I guess they fly away on the Red Baron that Martin Short can't fly, which is actually, I think, kind of a little bit of a funny scene with them like hanging off the wings and him just like, I can't fly this thing, which he can't fly because his stuntman flew it on the movie that he was actually in, where he was supposed to fly the plane. But before that, there's the scene where Martin Short is hanging from the piñata, like he's stuck in a piñata. Like they all try to swing in on these piñata strings. Like Steve Martin falls flat on his face and gets captured immediately. Chevy Chase swings into the room of Carmen's room, into her wardrobe, right? And then Martin Short gets stuck in this piñata. And Steve Martin, the Carmen helps him knock a guard out. He changes into bandito clothes, right, and goes down there. And they're sort of, El Guapo is going through, and he's like questioning, or he's not questioning. He's going through all the people, and he's like, "Remember when we did this, right?" And they're all like, saying these things together and chanting along. And they get to Chevy Chase, and he says, "Let's see, what is it?" He says that he's like, "Remember when we," and he's like, "burned the village." And then he's like, "and raped the horses and rode off on the women," right? Like, and everybody's chanting along with it, but El Guapo like he's like, this guy's definitely, a gringo and an imposter, and finds him out. And then he's like, "What are gringos falling from the sky?" And Martin Short just falls. And then the other guy's like, "Yes." But yeah, I mean, like you said, I think what makes that scene, Alex, is El Guapo and Jefe, right? It's not really actually like that, you know, Chevy or I mean, Martin Short just falls on his face, which I guess is like, but
And I'm gonna say, in that interview, they mentioned none of those people.
yeah, I'm sure.
They mentioned Fran Drescher not being in it and how great that was. They mentioned Sam Kinison not being in it, how great that was. In that interview, there is no mention of these other actors at all, right? They give them no credit, you know, or interest in it, which I find very telling also.
I also think, and you probably brought this up when you were talking earlier to me, but when you talked about the idea of this kind of comedy where the idea is, oh, we're making fun of everybody, right? Which in a sense they are, right? Like everybody is kind of, in some way, you're sort of making it's a joke about them. But it's like the ending, right, becomes the sort of heroism of these three. I mean, it's true, like the village actually, they convince them to sew together, and so they all sew mariachi outfits and out, so the village in some way you could say plays a role, right, in the kind of victory over El Guapo. But like it's so kind of paternalistic still, and it's like you could say you're making fun of everybody, but it's like, if these guys are this stupid, which they are, like all of the amigos are just treated as like total bumbling idiots, and they're what's needed in order to save this Mexican village from you know, these really stupid bandits and their own, you know, inability to figure out how to save themselves as these sort of noble savage characters or whatever. Like, again, like, it's still become like the outcome of it is still this sort of racist savior, you know, white savior kind of moment, even if they're dumb white saviors, right? So it's like, you know, I don't know. It doesn't work for me on that level. The kind of like everybody is made fun of.
You know, I'll say one thing, and I'd be curious your thoughts on this. You know, I know we've all heard the kind of liberal take that the problem with our government is it's just unintelligent. You know, I'm sure we've all heard that version. I wonder how much like a movies like this contribute to that kind of liberal like thought, even if it's somewhat like unconscious. Like the issue is that, you know, there's a lack of like sophistication within it, right? We have like unsophisticated people. It's not capitalism, it's not imperialism. It's a lack of like sophisticated that maybe leads to a lack of like morality or the ability to see what like the moral thing that needs to be done, right? And I wonder like how much like being consistently, you know, drugged by movies like this contributes to that kind of or reinforces that liberal kind of thinking.
Bro, this is SNL, right? We're talking about Lorne Michaels and Steve Martin. Like what you just described, right, is to a T the kind of SNL diehard liberal, right? That just, you know, that loves to just make fun of Trump or make fun of like, you know, George W. Bush, right? And like just how stupid, and it's always that they're so stupid, right? It's not that they're like, you know, they're imperial, right? Or that it's a capitalist project that feeds into all of this stuff. It's these dumb conservatives. If they would just be smarter like us liberal elite. I mean, this is why the right hates SNL, but it's also why the kind of blue MAGA liberals just love it, you know?
Yeah, that's what's going to defeat Trump. I mean, that was the whole Trump one thing, right? All we got to do is get Alec Baldwin on there to play him, and soon enough, that's what's going to lead to his political demise. Yeah, I mean, that's the SNL thing. This is how that's another way I viewed this film. It's just like SNL humor, and it's also like very like it's a really good point to me. It's like very condescending. It's paternalistic. It's like, what are we supposed to take away from that as an audience? I mean, that's what I'm left with at the end of them. Like what kind of messaging or ideas or humor or critique are we supposed to take away from this? And it's just like it's a similar reaction that I've had watching almost every SNL skit. I mean, I grew up watching, like in high school, I watched SNL. So that was like the Will Ferrell era. Like there were some things that would make me laugh, but I had a very similar sensation now that I think about it, like watching SNL then, the 90s, early 2000s, and then watching this film. And also, like, we
Yeah.
haven't talked about these ridiculous outfits, and we haven't talked about the ridiculous, like, little dance, which is what people remember from the film as well. They remember the dance, like the little Three Amigos dance. But those outfits, it's just like, it's just like it enhances their buffoonery, right? Like there's like, especially when you contrast them to like the what you call it, Jay, the bandito wear. It's just like an interesting way to like it's actually that's like revolutionary wear in that moment. Like that's what the revolutionaries are wearing. Okay, once in a while they might dress up kind of approximating what the Three Amigos are wearing to take a photo. Like there's a famous photograph of like Emiliano Zapata wearing like the charro outfit with like a cool sword, like way cooler than what these guys are wearing, right? But they look like, honestly, like look at what in the 80s, what a waiter at a really bad Mexican food restaurant would have like worn. So I mean, it adds to enhances their buffoonery, but it's really striking because it's a striking contrast with what like the villagers are wearing, and then what the bandidos led by El Guapo are wearing.
I mean, I think the telling thing is that they don't change their outfits to like liberate the people, right? That becomes the funny thing because I'm kind of like, I'm with you. I'm watching it. I'm like, oh, okay, I get the joke. They don't really get it. This is the trope that's coming out of America, and there's a way, but it's not like they go up in there and they throw in like, you know, the real outfits of like revolutionaries to help them, right? The seamstress of Tony. Yeah. You know, like, and it doesn't, they don't change. So I find it funny that, you know, we're gonna see these people in these terrible outfits liberate these people, and from, and it's like, yeah, I agree with you. It's like totally. And then the dance, yeah, I remember the dance people used to do it in school, right? I remember all the time, and it was like, and like, you know, the hip thrust, right? Which like that's like, I know, and this is where all the people be, oh, you're being too critical. I'm like, but that's imperial shit. Like, it is, dude. You go into the country, you get the women, right? It's that Conan line, right? What he says, you know, the women, right? What I was thinking about the women, you know, it's like you get there, you get the women, you get to do the hip thrust. It's so coded in that, right? And you think of like how much that's in the 80s, like the full metal jacket line of the sex worker that became so indicative of Vietnamese women, the racist thing. Movies like Revenge of the Nerds, right? This the kind of sex drive thing that needs to be constantly like pointed out. It's in this movie, right? And then of course, I mean, you didn't. The also the thing of like all the women love them when they come there. Like they're just like totally like, even before they get there, like when Carmen watches the movie, she sees there's a shot of her and Steve Martin, and she's just like, you know, falling apart, right? And there's that joke, you know, I like the unsmart one. They're like, which one? You know, like, you know, like there is that joke, right? But like all of them, they just totally gush over these men, and it's like, it's the fantasy, it's the total fantasia that the uncultured idiots can go into the periphery lands and just, you know, just be your uncultured self and you'll have a good time.
There's actually a piece that they cut out of the film where Carmen was supposed to be having a relationship with all three of them, right? So there's the piece where this is cut out, but it's like she's setting up dates with all of them, and she's like, "I'll meet with you at like, you know, 8 o'clock, and I'll meet with you at," but you know, these are separate conversations, right? But I'll meet you at 10. I'll meet you at 12, right? And so, thankfully, one of the evil overlords at the studio said, "Yeah, we're not putting that in there." But you know, it gives you, it still has the same kind of vibe. I mean, there's the woman that's falling all over Chevy, you know, Martin Short, and you know, Steve Martin. So yeah, they have their pick basically. Yeah. And I also think the hip thrust, right? It's the turn and cough, right? Like that's the thing, right? It's the hernia test, right?
It's also like the dance that everyone can do. Like you don't need rhythm. Like it gets reproduced, right? Like in the 90s, it'll lead to like the Macarena. Like it keeps like it's the same like format and style. Everyone can do this ridiculous little dance. But yeah, I totally remember kids doing it at school. Now that you say, I totally remember. Yeah.
All right. Anything else that we need to cover? No, nothing. No,
I
no
mean,
great gems.
I mean, not necessarily. I don't think I have anything else in here. I mean, that I haven't covered. I mean, the movie is that thin, y'all. Like, it really
So,
is that thin.
I mean, I would just say this: like, this is only what, this is episode 8,
Mm-hmm.
right? I would say this is by far the worst movie that we've watched so far. Like, um, and I mean, Year of the Dragon was like a very racist movie, but it still was better than this. Like,
Yeah.
at least I was like watching it, like kind of interested in what was going to happen in some respect, in a way that I just, like both of you were texting back and forth, and you both were like, I can't, I'm going to sleep. Like, or I fell asleep watching it last night. I'll try again tonight. Like, it's just hard. It was hard. It was a struggle to get through it.
I'll just say there's better movies to watch. I mean, Duck You Sucker, like that's my favorite Western, and I will always tell people like go watch Duck You Sucker or slash Fistful of Dynamite. Depends like how it gets represented. And then like the whole genre of like the border movie that really takes off in the 80s. There's a really interesting movie that Jack Nicholson is in where he plays a border patrol. That guy called The Border. I think it's like 1982, and it's just all about like border patrol corruption, which is really interesting.
Is it a Walter Hill movie?
I think so, if I remember.
Yeah,
I
haven't seen it.
It's an interesting movie. And then like I think Lone Star comes out in the 90s, but that's like a really interesting border movie, like a much more interesting, intriguing. That's a Western and it's a border movie at the same time that does a really cool thing with flashbacks and going back, like very like almost like Cormac McCarthy style take on like the border. But yeah, it's just those are way better, I guess. This one is if we're talking about like humor. I mean, I just Born in East LA for me is like the border transgression movie of the 80s with Cheech Marin. I mean, the way that we were shown that movie by our parents to be kind of like, if you become a Yo Sabo kid and you forget how to speak Spanish, you may get deported one day, and then you're not gonna be able to like function in Mexico. There was like a warning, like a tutelage type of film that our parents would show us, like don't abandon your quote unquote culture, don't lose your Spanish. But it's an interesting film. In terms of what the border and some of the border politics are looking like in the mid to late 1980s.
Right on. One thing you brought up, Alex, that I don't know if we talked about this directly. I think we kind of tangentially did, but like David Chavez was, he texted me and he was like, oh yeah, he was like, El Guapo was supposed to be Pancho Villa, and that this is their like version of demonizing, and I just thought of it too because you referenced them, the clothes that they're wearing are actually closer to like revolutionary garb in that period. And
yeah, but I think David's right. Pancho Villa becomes a stand-in for all bandits, particularly after when he invaded the U.S. And I think that trope lasts a lot longer than like because they rebring like the noble savage trope with like Elia Kazan's movie on Emiliano Zapata, where that director was really trying to find like a non-communist revolutionary leader to do a movie on in the 1950s. So he chose Zapata, and Marlon Brando plays Zapata, and there's all sorts of weird things about how they taped his eyelids down to make him look more quote unquote Mexican. Brando was like a G, but like this movie is just it's just not whatever. But yeah, I think David's right. I think that Pancho Villa does become the stand-in for like the bandit, and then we lose obviously like the radical revolutionary content of who he represented, what he thought, and what he actually did. And this is why John Reed's book, even though he kind of traffics in some of the same tropes, like I think he does get at the core of what this guy was fighting for, and why so many people followed him in that revolutionary endeavor. And it wasn't about private property relations.
Yeah, and the other thing you brought up that we probably touched on a little bit is just the point about Westerns, right? And that like the indigenous people, right, being the kind of the villains, right, in the Western so often. And similarly, here it is the bandits, right? It is El Guapo that kind of play that role within the sort of stereotypical kind of Western genre or whatever.
Yeah, I love Westerns, man. I grew up watching them because of my dad, and I'm glad that growing up I was able to develop a more like a different type of critique about what these Westerns are. But they do I think they teach us so much about American culture, American history, like the id of like Americanism. And yeah, I think Nick Estes would tell us that the indigenous peoples are the original specter, right, for the U.S. If we go by the Declaration of Independence, then we also know insurrectionary black slaves are also like the other half, right? But then like the third one that comes along are the Mexican bandits. And it's interesting to see how that kind of stuff plays out in some of the Westerns, particularly in the 60s and 70s. And it gets represented in this like attempted comedic effort, with the Three Amigos.
Yeah. All right. Well,
And let's
thanks,
say I will
everybody.
say the last thing I'll say is like the bandits haven't gone away, right? The bandits are just undocumented migrants, refugee seekers, asylum seekers, or the narcos. They're still here.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, that's the way that they want to portray it all, right?
Exactly.
You know. So a couple questions from the audience or comments. So it's a good question. Was because I said this was the first comedy that we did. RoboCop is so much better of a movie that it's in a class of its own. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely comedy there. I think that's what's interesting about this film is like there's some ways that it's sort of trying to be satire, and it, in my view, like totally fails to connect it. And it's like it's really low level comedy that's actually going on throughout it. But like those initial scenes with the studio and everything, you're like, oh, it could be setting up to kind of satirize the way Hollywood, portrayed Mexicans in this time of year and the interests behind it and all that. And it just doesn't do any of that. All right. And the haters were lying. It's a funny movie. So there are dissenting views to ours.
Hey, Jay, I just realized that you've asked me to come on the show twice with like about media or movie representations. And so obviously 3 Amigos, but the first one was Lioness. So next time you ask me to do like a media movie show critique, I'm just going to tell you no, because I know it's going to be something awful and not something cool like Predator or RoboCop. So there's my warning.
We promise to give you a cool one next time you come on.
You gotta get a cool one.
We could talk about G.I. Joe, and you can bring your Cobra tattoo out, and
I'm joined.
Well, I'm gonna get you to talk to about Duck You Sucker with me within our gates. So on my podcast.
Oh hell yeah,
so,
that'd be a lot of fun.
We definitely got to do that because
there's
a lot of your thoughts on that movie are exactly mine, and it's what I've always struggled with that movie that I quite like a lot. But that ending always
I love that movie.
Bites
yeah. Oh hell yeah.
It always bites me. I'm like,
Wait, someone put up. Yeah, that'd be awesome. I would love to.
Yo,
yeah, Bloodsport. Yes.
Well,
that's got to be David Chavez in the chat, by the way. Yeah.
I mean, the problem with that problem is we're gonna spend the whole time about how it's a lie.
What? No, how dare you say it's a lie? What?
How it's a complete fabrication.
You're calling Frankie Dukes a liar? What?
Frank Dukes. I mean, Van Damme was so crushed when he found out that it was all fake.
Van Damme's son attended ASU and got kicked out because he stabbed a roommate.
Okay, I know about that.
ASU. Yeah,
I didn't know it was at ASU, but I know about that.
Here. I had just arrived, I think, here. Yeah. Anyway,
right on. All right. Well, Alex, thank you, and I promise next time we'll bring you back
it's all good,
for something better.
It's always fun. Hey, we find some good stuff out of it. I'm just kidding. It's always fun to be on, man. Thank you.
Yeah, we may torture ourselves with a few clips, and if so, we'll throw it up on Patreon later. But that's only if Alex doesn't just run away after I hit the end button here, right? So, anyways, support the Patreon. Appreciate everybody coming through and enjoying this. Next time, the next one. So we're off for like a week. Oh shoot, my earbud. We're off for like a week. And then on the 19th, we'll be back with Brooke to do Brooke Terpstra. We're going to do Platoon. And then the 22nd, we have Amberine. We're going to do Raiders of the Lost Ark. And then there's one more scheduled.
Badge of the Assassin, right?
Oh, right. Orasami Burton is going to come through to do Badge of the Assassin so that we could talk about that terrible anti-BLA made-for-TV movie. So, yeah, which will be a brutal one, too. Anyway, all right. Thanks again, Alex. This was great. Appreciate you.
Alex.
Appreciation to the chat and everybody.
Thank
Have
you,
a
guys.
good one.